what we don't always do is step back and listen to the facts. Just hear the emotion, because it's hard to have a conversation with someone without hearing their emotion. And their lens is through all of this, but to hear what they have to say. So as this day has evolved, this particular segment has evolved, we have two folk who are on different sides of Initiative 42 to talk about where they are, but also the role education and public education plays in the crafting, their vision of crafting the society they think, from their vantage point, and we all have one, it ought to look like. So, having said that, we're going to begin with Forrest Thigpen. Welcome, Forrest.
Thank you.
To the Mississippi Education Reform Collaborative Leadership Academy.
Well, and I have to tell you, I love what you said, and I agree. I love when I'm challenged in what I say or what I believe, so that if there are gaps, I can fill them in, and especially when I have conversations with people who are of a different political persuasion, for instance, or different racial background, that there's always something for me to learn, and I love that. And so for people who are, we can just go ahead and get this out of the way. I run an organization that is, I don't like labels, but generally we would be labeled as conservative. And would you agree with that?
Oh, understatement, but okay.
And I have some quote, liberal friends who I love talking with and have spent a lot of time with them, and I always learn something new, especially when it comes to anything that may have racial connotations. We generally fall into the rut of what we have grown up thinking, or what we have been taught, or what we, after investigating, we believe ourselves, even though we haven't been exposed enough to other perspectives. And so it is very important in order for us to cross the boundaries and overcome so many of the obstacles we face as a society. It's critically important for us to do exactly what you're saying, and to listen to each other, and to try to get through the emotional things to what are the facts. Not to discount anybody's emotion. You know, people need to be passionate about what they believe, but they need to know what they believe first, and then they need to know the facts behind what they're talking about. That would be helpful to the discussion. So hopefully we will be able to accomplish that today.
Mississippi is the only state that does not have a standard in our Constitution for what kind of public schools we ought to have. Interestingly enough, in the 1890 Constitution, we had a provision that said we had to have a uniform system of public schools. We know that wasn't done, but at least it was a standard in the Constitution in 1960 for reasons we all understand. They took that out of the Constitution, said the legislature could abolish public schools if they wanted to. In 1987, they put something back in, but it said the legislature could do whatever it wanted to. So we're the only state, we had to have public schools, but the legislature was subject to legislative direction. We're the only state that doesn't have a standard in our Constitution. The purpose of having a standard in the Constitution is to establish a floor for public education. Hopefully the legislature will do a lot better than whatever your constitutional floor is, but the purpose of having something in the Constitution is to just say the government has to at least do this. It's like any other constitutional right, free speech, freedom of religion, freedom from search and seizure. Police can't just beat you up for no reason, those sorts of things. And we also looked and found that Mississippi is substantially behind surrounding states in terms of having funding for public education. I think anybody, everybody always wants more money. Sure, you believe in what you're doing, you want more money. You think if you had more money, you could do a better job. But to me, the question was, how can we objectively say that our schools are underfunded? We have the adequate education formula. Of course, that's one standard, but also if you look at surrounding states, we're 30% per pupil behind Louisiana, substantially behind Arkansas, behind Alabama, and even Tennessee. So, and we also have some other objective indicators that we've got problems, including, I'm told that over half of our students who choose to go to college, who graduate from high school and choose to go to college, have to have some kind of remedial program when they get to our state colleges and universities. We know the legislature has not funded the adequate education program, but there's another way to look at it. 40% of the state budget is devoted to K-12 education. But as new money is coming in, the state is not devoting 40% of new money to public education. They're not coming anywhere close to it. In fact, some years it's gone down. So what we said, what was figured out was that the adequate education formula could be met if we had, we just take looking at historic growth patterns in state tax revenues. If you took just 25% of the new money, not 40%, 25% of the new money over a period of years, we could get back up to at least the standard that had been set by the adequate education program. Since we don't believe that the legislature is going to do that voluntarily, a group of us got together and put together a constitutional amendment to be voted on by the people that would, the standard we propose is adequate and efficient public education. That has been, those words are used in some other state constitutions. Adequate obviously takes some meaning from the adequate education program, but you don't want to put the adequate education program itself in the Constitution. It may not be perfect, and the Constitution is supposed to be something that can last for a long time. And efficient is a word that's been given meaning by other courts in other states to mean, for example, you got to be competitive with surrounding states. So that's where we came up with the words. What courts only get involved in education as a last resort. As I said, it's kind of a floor. They set a floor, they don't set a ceiling. They don't. What courts have typically done is they say things like, with the Arkansas Supreme Court, when there was a litigation there, said, our teachers aren't being paid what surrounding states are being paid. A very high percentage of our students are having to have remedial education when they go to college. This, that, and the other. Legislature, go fix it. And to the satisfaction of that court, the legislature did. The same kind of thing happened in Kentucky, which is where all this really got going back in the 1980s. What the Kentucky Supreme Court did was identify why the education system was not adequate or efficient and told the legislature to go fix it. The reason I bring that up is the people who oppose our constitutional amendment act like that passing this amendment would turn one judge, sometimes they say Hinds County, but our amendment doesn't say anything about Hinds County, turn one judge into education czar for the state, and that's just not what has happened in other states. Of course, you have to go to a judge to enforce a constitutional right. You have to go to a judge to enforce any constitutional right. Free speech, freedom from search and seizure, any of those rights are enforced in the first instance by judges, but of course, judicial opinions or judicial decisions are appealed in the Mississippi Supreme Court, which is a very conservative group on issues like this, as shown by the recent vote where the court refused to straighten out the title of the legislative alternative to our proposal. So we think it's a good proposal. Y'all know a lot better than I what the needs are. But that's why we put it together, and that's why we hope it'll pass.
Okay, then I'll challenge y'all as an audience that when I say the first sentence of this, don't put me in that rut. Okay? I believe that it's the parents' responsibility to raise their children. And, oh, thank you.
Are you afraid, are you surprised that black people clapping at that?
No,
Okay.
not at all on that part.
Okay.
But the second half of the sentence is, I think that includes their education. I think parents ought to be I think God has given parents the responsibility to raise their children, including how they're educated. And if they choose to involve others, so this is not necessarily that you have to homeschool. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying if you choose to involve others, whether that's on Sunday school teachers, whether it's coaches or mentors or public school teachers or private school teachers, whatever is necessary to get your child what your child needs, you ought to be equipped to do that. You ought to be enabled to do that. And so that is really the foundational belief that I come from and that my organization comes from in looking at education policy.
And so what does that lead to in terms of priorities for your organization in terms of education policies?
Well, we think parents ought to have options for where they send their children. We think that public education is a critical component, and we need to make sure that it is doing well and doing right. Another basic belief that we have is that competition helps. The reason okay, let me ask you, how many of you have a mobile phone, a cell phone? You wouldn't have that if it weren't for competition. And you wouldn't have a better version if it weren't for competition. So, and even though that is in the for-profit sector, the fact is that's because human nature is such that you respond to competition. If you think there's somebody else who is trying to get your job, then you're going to do your job better. If you think that there's somebody who is trying to take your place on the team, an athletic team, you're going to work harder. And so it's just human nature that regardless of your genuine desire, in my organization, if I perceive that there is somebody who is competing, even from our own perspective, some new organization has been created that believes sort of what we believe, and now they're out there trying to raise money. We don't take any government money at all. So I have to raise money from individuals primarily. And so if there's some other organization that's competing, it makes me work harder at what I do, even though I believe passionately in what I do. It's the reason I do what I do. So for you as educators, you believe, I don't question at all that you have a great passion and that you are doing the best you can, but if there's the possibility that you'll lose students to another school because you're not getting the job done, it is human nature that you're going to work harder or try newer things that actually accomplish the goal, especially if you are in a district that for whatever reason is not performing well. And so we think parents ought to have those options, and we think that that competition actually enhances the whole system. There was a federally funded study of schools in Florida, I guess about 5 years ago, and they found that in this study that so this was not an advocacy organization, this was a federally funded study that found that in places where there was some competition, a little bit of competition for public schools, maybe there were charter schools, at the time they had, I guess they still do to some degree, have some type of voucher programs or special needs scholarships, a little bit like what we have here starting this year. So this study said where there's a little bit of competition, the students do better in the regular public school. Do better than they did the year before. Where there's a lot of competition, the students in the regular public schools do a lot better. So the idea there is that healthy competition actually improves what we say is our goal, and that is to have children who grow up who are well educated.
So Luther, tell me a little bit about you and why this is important to you. I know we got that initially from him. I mean, you know.
Well, I'm a graduate of the Jackson Public Schools. Our children, we live in Belhaven. Our children went to the Jackson Public Schools through the 8th grade. My family's lived in Mississippi for a long time. I care about the future of Mississippi. And I was asked to get involved because I'm a lawyer and have been involved in a number of constitutional arguments over the last 30 years. I advocated on behalf of Brad Dodd being able to appoint committees in the Mississippi Senate. I advocated on behalf of Governor Fordyce being able to exercise a line item veto. We lost that one. I have been involved with the Pascagoula schools, helping them get back the ad valorem tax revenue that the legislature wanted to take from them and give to Jackson County. So because I've been involved in state constitutional issues, the people that are behind Initiative 42 asked me to help them.
In Mississippi, we had Brown, the federally, Supreme Court, you got Brown, and it took 30 years before the state finally got to it.
Yeah.
I mean, so having a court intervene on the behalf of those who are the least is a part of the history of this country and a part of the checks and balances, right? So that you have the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branches in ways that helps us all be better.
Yeah.
So having in this, the initiative having language that says the courts not have a place in this, sounds like a good thing to me.
Yeah, I understand that.